First of all, just so I have it on the disc, can you tell me your name?
My full name is Paul Sahni.
Can I ask you how old you are? How old you are?
I'm 82 now.
And can you explain to me how you came to be a reporter in the Kashmir Valley in 47?
You see, I had done about 6 months training in London with London Times in 1946. And I returned home in Srinagar. And we had family business. I was not very keen to join that. So I was almost on the loose end trying to write some pieces, etc. when the Pakistani invasion came about. And then in Srinagar descended on 27th, 28th and 29th. Almost a group of about 7 or 8 journalists from Delhi with the Royal Indian Air Force planes.
Can you remember who?
Yes, there was K.S. Ramachandran of PTI, and it was M. Subhan of Times of India and Indian News Chronicle. There was Pran Chopra, Statesman. 4 of them came together. Anyway,
any foreign journalists?
They didn't come in on that particular day, but they did come 29th or 30th.
But about you, were you a state subject?
Yes, of course.
You were born where?
I was born in Srinagar, and born and educated most of the time in Srinagar. So when they came, now I was interested, and I was a friend of the son of the governor of Kashmir at that time, Mr. Maharaj Kishandhar. His son Pratap was a good friend of mine. So I was in touch with the governor's house. Governor at that time meant a district magistrate, no more than that. So I knew what was going on, and how the attack had taken place, and how Mahura had been captured, and how a senior officer from Delhi had come, which was later learned to be V.P. Menon, and he had met the Maharaja and advised him to go away to Jammu, etc., etc. So this background there, I was curious, and I was also in touch with Sheikh Abdullah's National Conference leadership at that time, since I was a student leader earlier.
In the National Conference?
No, I was not part of the National Conference. I was a friend of the leaders of National Conference, but I originally belonged to Congress, although there was no Congress set up there. But ideologically speaking, I was General Secretary of All India Students' Federation. 2 General Secretaries, one from Lucknow and one from Srinagar at that time. So I was quite close to all the political activists. So I got the feedback from the National Conference, and I also got the feedback from the government side. So I knew what was going on, and I was very curious to know a little more. So I used to go up and down Srinagar, from the cantonment area to the National Conference headquarters, which was immediately shifted to the Palladium in Lal Chowk, the burnt-out cinema house. You may have seen that. So we picked up that the troops would be landing tomorrow morning. So next morning, that is 27th, we kept on looking up at the skies, and ultimately around about 8 o'clock or so, we heard the drone of a plane. And, there was a sigh of relief all over Srinagar. In the meantime, the news had trickled in that the Pakistanis had entered Baramulla, and they had started killing people, because some people had escaped from Baramulla and come to Srinagar and reported to a national conference. Makbul Sherwani was not part of it because he was not allowed to come back. So after these guys, the journalists, landed on 28th, now I knew 2 or 3 of them even earlier. So I went and met them. And they were very happy, and they tried.
They were staying at Nedu's?
No, they didn't stay there. You see, they were staying as part of the wherever the army setup was, that is near the airport, after the troops landed, because Nedu's was functional at that time, but they came to the town with the army itself in the civil. They had sort of commandeered a local passenger bus, a 14-seater bus, civilian, which was being used by the journalists and the PRO, etc., because the army didn't have any transport at that time. So we met them on 28th itself, and they stayed there 2 or 3 days. You know, the army was very disorganized at that time because they were coming in and they had no infrastructure, no transport, no accommodation, no nothing. So they used to get feedback, local feedback, and I used to take them to the National Conference activists, etc., Bakshi Ghulam Ahmad and Sadiq and all these people, and Sheikh Abdullah too. So before they went back, you see, they stayed. One of these journalists stayed 3 days, some stayed 2 days, 4 days. They had to go back. Now they wanted a local stringer, and since I had got my training earlier and I was available, so to say, so on 30th of October, Subhan, who was the Times of India and the Indian News Chronicle man, he said, "Look, can you do this for us? Can you sort of take on this responsibility?" And I said yes, and that is how I came into regular reporting. So I became a correspondent of Indian News Chronicle.
From Srinagar?
From Srinagar. And then in about 10 days' time, we got our accreditation from the Defense Ministry of India and became a war correspondent. And then, as you know, the Battle of Shaltang took place on 3rd and 4th and 5th, culminating on the 7th. And the Pakistanis were pushed back to Baramulla from Patan. And Baramulla was liberated on 7th. But they didn't allow us to go till 11th. So 11th they allowed 2 or 3 individual journalists. Among them was Robert Trumbull and who else? One more.
The API correspondent, perhaps?
I wouldn't recall the name. Okay. Anyway, they were allowed. Then Pandit Nehru arrived in Srinagar on 13th of November, and 14th morning they allowed 3 of us, one All India radio man, one API. PTI was at that time Associated Press of India. So API journalist and that man and myself, 3 of us were allowed to accompany the Prime Minister of India when he visited Baramulla.
Tell me about that. How did you travel to Baramulla?
Oh, well, as I told you, this rickety old bus, because by then, of course, the army had brought in a few jeeps and one-tonners. Of course, the Prime Minister was taken in a army vehicle car. Of course, some jeeps accompanied the convoy, but 3 of us plus PRO, etc., we were given a passenger bus, and we traveled in that to Baramulla and back.
What did you see in Baramulla?
Well, the Baramulla looked like a ghost city at that time. I was told that the original population was something like nearly 11,000 people when Baramulla was at its best. It was a major trading town on the Srinagar-Rawalpindi route, and also access from Sopore and Lalau Valley and all the walnut and the apple trade used to go through Baramulla. So it was a very prosperous town, and a number of Christians and Sikhs and some Hindu shopkeepers were there, but majority, of course, was Muslims. And the convent, St. Joseph's School and St. Joseph's Convent, and the hospital, they were on almost the outskirts of Baramulla, you can say at that time, because main city or town was on the either banks of Jhelum River. And we were taken to the convent, and we saw the freshly dug graves, rather, of course, at that time covered, of the individuals who had been killed during the first 2 days of the arrival of the Lashkar and the Pakistani officers. We also met 2 or 3 nuns at that time who were still there, and of course we were shown the spot where Sherwani had been killed, and then the Prime Minister visited the hospital. He visited the school, St. Joseph's School. He visited the Sikh Gurdwara, where some refugees had taken shelter, and he also visited the formation commander's small headquarters, you can say. I mean, 3 tents were there, no more. And a brigadier was in charge at that time. So what we saw was burned down buildings. Smoke was still coming out, although it was almost 12 days after the event. Those smoldering coals and cinders and some pieces of wood, timber, they were still sort of emitting smoke and smell, a lot of it. That's about all, because we were there for about 4 hours and then came back in the evening and then filed our reports.
What was the mood of the people in Baramulla? Was there anybody in Baramulla?
There were a few people, but I think not more than 100 odd people who were there. They came to see the Prime Minister and Bakshi Ghulam Ahmad, the Deputy Prime Minister of Kashmir at that time, who was accompanying the Prime Minister, and of course the Army Brigadier L.P. Sen was there.
Sheikh Abdullah wasn't there?
No, Sheikh Abdullah did not accompany Panditji on that day to Baramulla, because there was a lot of activity in Srinagar. You know, there was absence of the administration, and there was very strict rationing of food and POL, and there was short of supply. And the administration, which had been almost picked up from the roadside, you can say, now this emergency administration headed by Sheikh Abdullah was very deeply involved in all that to bring some kind of order, and so that there are no food riots and all. So he decided to stay back. And since the Prime Minister was going, the Deputy Prime Minister, who was in charge of the Home Affairs, so to say, was asked to accompany him.
And did you go beyond Baramulla?
No. At that particular time, we were not permitted, for 2 reasons, I think. Firstly, the army was involved in pursuing the Pakistanis. And secondly, since we were part of the entourage of the Prime Minister, and we were more keen to see exactly what the Prime Minister was seeing and listening to what he was going to say or talk to people. So we had no intention of going beyond. I mean, we hadn't gone to cover the war. We had gone we accompanied the Prime Minister to his visit to Baramulla. So that was the idea. We didn't go beyond.
And the mood in Srinagar at that time, how were things in Srinagar?
Srinagar by then had sort of become more comfortable than it was on 27th, 28th and 30th. You see, after the Battle of Shaltang, things had improved considerably. And the Battle of Badgam, where Major Sharma laid down his life, the mood in Srinagar had changed radically. People were feeling secure, and life had become, I won't call it normal, but it was no longer abnormal.
And in your work as a correspondent, you became a war correspondent. Yeah. But at this stage, did you see any of the captured Lashkar?
Yes, of course. Well, you see, we were shown the dead bodies of people who had been killed during the action. And we also, the Prime Minister was invited into a tent where 3 of the Lashkar individuals, soldiers you might call them, or volunteers or whatever it is, they were there, and they were all Pathans, Afridis. We met them, we talked to them, and they said we didn't know why we were here, but we were asked to go for a jihad, that there were atrocities being committed on the Muslims in Kashmir, so we were asked to go and liberate them. That's why we are. And we asked them, why did you burn the houses and the shops and kill people and loot and all that? They said, we were told that this is to be done. We are not going to stay here. We have come here to kill people and take back whatever we can.
What did they look like, the attackers?
Well, they had big built bodies, and I wouldn't call them looking ferocious, but they looked normal, but big built, and they were odd in shalwar kameez, etc. And 2 of them had bareheaded. They were bareheaded, and only one had sort of a turban tied round. We met 3 of them.
And at the convent, what was the scene at the convent? How badly damaged was that?
You see, convent, we went into the main chapel, and the chapel had, some of its windows had been broken, so one of the stained windows were broken, the main table on the raised platform, that had been thrown down, and some of the utensils there were also still lying on the ground, and we were shown the place where one of the nuns had been killed, and there were some blood stains still there. That's about all that we saw there inside. But of course, in the hospital area, there was more damage.
What sort of damage?
And then we were shown the graves, as I said, of Colonel Dyke, Mrs. Dyke, Barreto, and one more, 4 or 5. And I took photographs of that place, which was used in the newspapers with my report.
Which newspapers did your report appear in?
At that time, Indian News Chronicle. And as I mentioned to you, by middle of November, Blitz Weekly from Bombay, they had sent Mr. Raghavan, their correspondent in Delhi, had come to Srinagar. And since there were not many journalists or people who could become journalists available, so he got in touch with me and said that since you are already accredited as a war correspondent, would it be possible to write some pieces for us sometime? So I started working for them as well as a stringer. But later on I did a whole series for Blitz, but that was in 48 and 49.
And you were a photographer as well?
Yeah.
And how did you file your stories?
Well, this is a very interesting question. You know, we were supposed to hand over, either handwritten or typed, whatever the situation was, hand over our stories to the PRO, Public Relations Officer, At that time, the defense ministry...
The Army PRO?
Yeah, Army PRO. At that time, the setup in the defense ministry in Delhi was unlike what it is today. Today, you have a director of public relations, etc. At that time, it was called Armed Forces Information Office. And first it was headed by a full colonel, later on it was headed by a brigadier. So, and it used to be almost a captain, never a major during the war. Captain used to be the PRO in Srinagar with the army formation. And we used to hand over our reports to him. Now, depending on what time it was given, if it was till 2 o'clock in the afternoon, then he would hand it over to the Air Force. And the Air Force would carry them. And the packet was carried from there and delivered to the Defense Ministry official at the airport at Palam in Delhi. And they used to scrutinize the reports, and late in the evening they would telephone our respective offices to come and collect the report from the correspondent. That was one. But if it was after 2 o'clock, then we used to hand it them over, and they would, through the signals, army signals, it used to be transmitted by Morse code to Delhi, and then transcribed, and then handed over to our offices. Sometimes it got delayed by a day.
How did the photographs get down?
Well, photographs went through the Air Force packet.
And was there much censorship?
Well, censorship to the extent that all the reports had to be handed over to the PRO. So we had no means to file directly. And they scrutinized every report at the Armed Forces Information Office in New Delhi in the Defense Ministry. So it was virtual censorship.
And there was you couldn't just pick up a phone and ring your news desk?
No, it was impossible. I mean, we have worked under such difficult conditions that you just can't imagine today.
So
there was no telephone system as such.
So if your office wanted to contact you, how would they do that?
They couldn't. It used to be a telegram that used to come. You see, the telephone system at that time in Jammu and Kashmir state belonged to the state government. And it used to be routed through the Indian Telegraph Service or telephone service as such. Now that had become part of Pakistan. You know, under the standstill agreement, Pakistan was supposed to give all these services. They agreed to do that, but they squeezed the whole thing in the month of September before launching the attack. So we had no postal service with the rest of the country. We had no telephonic, no telegraph service at that time. There were no links.
So, did you see much of the Western journalists who came through Srinagar?
You see, we used to meet only at the briefing, and because they were staying, most of them stayed in Nido's hotel, but one or two of them stayed with Percy Brown in a houseboat. Percy Brown was an art critic and a painter of repute who used to live in a houseboat on Jhelum near the Srinagar club. So 2 of them stayed there and 2 or 3 stayed in Nido's hotel. But we didn't have too much to do with each other because, you see, firstly, we were more keen to get the political side also, and they were not interested at that time on the political aspect of the story. They're more interested in the Pakistani invasion and the armed engagements and action at different points.
Did you know Sidney Smith at all, the one who...
No, Sidney Smith, you see, was there in the last week of October, but he had hired a motorbike and he travelled on his own most of the time. He did not attend the briefings at all. None of the briefing which I was present.
So he was a loner?
I wouldn't call it a loner, but I think he was not reporting day to day. he wanted an overall picture of what was going on. So he was more interested in that aspect.
What was the Srinagar?
Although he reported, I'm told he reported for Sydney Herald. He wrote some pieces, but I'm not too sure.
What was the Srinagar press corps like before the war started? Who was based in Srinagar?
There were 2 or 3 individuals, I'll tell you. There was R.K. Kark, who worked for Statesman and also worked for Civil and Military Gazette. He died about 14, 15, 16 years ago. Now, he was one, and then there was Goshlal Kaul, who used to work for, but not on regular basis, for Hindustan Times. That's about all. I think API was represented, but I don't know the name of he was a stringer.
And what about the Kashmiri Press itself?
Kashmiri Press, of course, there were 2 or 3 papers at that time. One was Hamdard, the other was Khidmat, and there was another paper. Then there was the one Kashmir Chronicle, was another weekly, English weekly. That was about all.
The Kashmir Times?
Oh no, Kashmir Times came on the scene much later, 1954.
Were any of these papers published during the Troubles, or did they stop publication?
I think Hamdard and Khidmat continued to publish.
But not the Kashmir Chronicle?
No, Kashmir Chronicle, as I told you, was a weekly and should have published, but I don't recall. I met Goshlal almost every second, third day, but I'm not too sure whether he published reports in the months of November, December, January, because there was no electricity and no nothing. You see, life was very difficult.
What was the mood in Srinagar before the invasion?
One of apprehension. People didn't know what was in store for them. They didn't know what is likely to happen. And you see, there was shortage of almost everything that you could think of. Now, wheat flour was in shortage, rice was in shortage, there was hardly any sugar available, very little salt available, pulses, etc., vegetables which had to come from the surrounding rural areas didn't come because of lack of transport, etc., all kinds of things. So life was very, very difficult there. But it was very peaceful, very orderly.
And Sheikh Abdullah was popular once he was released from jail?
Very popular. Very, very popular. There's no doubt about it. And there was, you see, one thing is remarkable, that while the rest of India and Pakistan, after its creation, there was bloodbath all over. There was trouble in Jammu too. But in Kashmir Valley, it was absolutely peaceful and harmonious life. There was no sense of insecurity of any kind.
What was the popular view of the Maharaja?
You see, there were 2 diametrically opposed views. One was, of course, the view held by the ruling class, you might say, the government employees and all. They were all for Maharaja. But the popular public mood was against Maharaja's rule. Not as much as an alien or an outsider, but more as a sort of an autocratic ruler, not allowing people to participate in the administration and not allowing people to secure their rightful share.
Did you see the Maharaja?
Oh, yes.
What did you think of him?
Oh, well, I thought he was a fine gentleman, a very highly cultured individual. Yes. I met him a number of times.
What did he look like?
Well, he was about 5'10" or maybe 5'11" in height, and He was not slim, he was a slightly portly looking person, quite handsome, uh, not bald exactly, but receding hair, and very pleasant to talk to. We used to converse in English very well. Of course, he was fond of good life and played very fond of polo. Uh, Half of his day was spent in either looking after the stable and, you see, outside the palace, just below the, the Grand International in Srinagar, is a quadrangle of rooms, which now used for I don't know what, but those used to be the stables of his polo horses. And he used to visit that place twice a day to see how the horses are being looked after. And then in the evenings, he almost, if he was not playing polo, he was going riding. So he was very fond of that.
Was the general expectation that sooner or later he would sign up with India?
I won't be able to tell you this part of it because now in retrospect I know how things went. But at that particular time, we had not much knowledge about that, except, as I told you, since I was very close to the family of the governor, all the reports that used to come in from the border areas used to come in to the governor as district magistrate. And since he did not want his official setup to get to know that because it might leak, and it was highly confidential reports that used to come from various officers or areas. Those used to come into his office and he used to bring them to home. And since I had a typewriter and I was very close to the family, or almost part of the family, sometimes when his confidential typist was not available, I was doing the typing part of it, of the report. And then his son, who was my friend or my classmate, in his car, we used to go to the palace at night and deliver these reports to his Maharaja's brother-in-law, who was a private secretary.
Who was that?
Kanwar Nachin Singh.
And this was in the run-up to the
It
invasion?
was up in the run-up, that is September, October, I'm talking.
What sort of picture did you get from that access to those, that very privileged access to those reports?
Well, as I said, we got the reports of, I'm talking of Kashmir. We didn't know about Jammu so much. The Kashmir reports said that there was panic in the border areas, and the state troops who were posted at Dumail and Muzaffarabad was not very important at that time. Dumail was, because that was the subdivisional office, you might say. And one of the state force battalions was posted there, JK Rifles. And reports coming in from there, that covered part of the Poonch area, which was south of Poonch, southeast of Poonch, and of course the Kishan-Ganga Valley, and border area from Murree to Kohala to Dumail. Reports were coming in from that area, and they were sort of reports of panic, reports of scare, fear, but they had the reports that there was something likely to happen. And some of the people had already started leaving Kohala, Dumail, Gadi, even Uri, and come to Baramulla.
When did you hear that the Lashkar had entered the state?
You see, what happened was on the 24th of October was the Dussehra day. And the Maharaja used to hold a darbar in what is now the hotel on the boulevard, the Grand Hotel, the Grand International. The present dining hall was the Darbar Hall at that time. And my father was one of the Darbaris, or a courtier, you might say. And he had gone to attend this Darbar. And while the Darbar was on, electricity went off. And the only powerhouse we had was in Mahura at that time, which is about 55 miles away from Srinagar on the road to Uri. So we had no idea what had happened. I mean, of course, we knew that Pakistanis had already entered the state. So when he returned from the palace, he brought the news that it seems that Pakistanis have reached Mahura and destroyed it or damaged it. So that was the confirmation of the arrival of the Pakistani Lashkar.
So how was that news greeted by the people of Srinagar?
As I told you, the apprehension had been there already. Now there was nothing to hold them back, except for a very small group which was under Brigadier Rajendra Singh, but not many people knew about it. So they thought there was nothing between the Pakistanis Lashkar and Srinagar. So on the morning of 25th, everyone thought that perhaps on that very day, the Lashkar will arrive in Srinagar. So some of the people wanted to get away, but there was no way to go out. And so some of them managed to go to the villages in the surrounding area, but not many people. Those were the people who either had the means or who had the knowledge about what was happening. But the number was very, very small. Otherwise, people were about the uncertainty of what is likely to happen. But there was no panic. And there was no looting, there was no attack on anyone, no nothing. But feeling of desperation, a feeling of panic was not there, but fear of the uncertain.
And there were no scheduled air services at that stage?
Oh, none. There was no air service, there was no airport as such. And this was just a landing strip. So and there was only one plane that the Maharaja had. So there was no air service.
So if you wanted to go to Delhi, how did you do it?
Impossible. You just couldn't go.
But before this trouble, how would you get to Delhi?
You see, the period before, of course, as I told you, till about March of 1947, the Baramulla road was being used to go to Rawalpindi, and from Rawalpindi to come to Jammu.
So to go to Jammu, you had to go via Rawalpindi?
Via Rawalpindi at that time, because the road was, snow was blocking the road between Srinagar and Jammu.
Were there Patiala state forces in the valley?
No, this is absolutely wrong. There were no forces till 27th of October.
Not even Patiala forces on a friendly basis?
No, none.
And when the Indian troops arrived on that morning?
Yeah, they didn't come to Srinagar.
People didn't see them in the streets?
No.
But they saw the planes?
They saw the planes, all right, but they didn't know whether it has brought troops or what. I mean, there was no means to get the news. So troops landed there. Of course, the information had come in that the troops are landing. So the National Conference, volunteers, etc., managed to commandeer whatever vehicles were available, passenger buses or trucks, and took them to the airstrip or airport. And from there, the troops, after they disembarked, were put in those vehicles and taken straight to Patan. They were not brought to Srinagar. What for? They didn't want to lose any time. So they all went straight to Patan. Some went a little beyond, but most of them were this side of Patan.
What did the people of Srinagar think when they discovered that the Maharaja had gone?
You see, as I told you, there was no means to get to know things as they were happening. If I got to know that Maharaja has gone, well, the people who hated him were jubilant. Those who were part of the government were apprehensive that now that he's gone, we do not know what would happen. There was apprehension, but that was a very small circle.
So there was no popular reaction?
No popular reaction whatsoever, because people didn't know what was happening.
This debate about the Instrument of Accession and where it was signed and when it was
signed. It was signed in Jammu. It was signed in Jammu on 26th.
When the Maharaja arrived?
Was here. Because VP Menon came to Srinagar on 25th, but advised him to leave that night, and Maharaja arrived on the 26th morning. He was in Jammu. And VP Menon flew back to Jammu from Delhi with this letter that, sorry, we cannot give you any assistance unless you sign this. And he showed him the Instrument of Accession, which was the normal that the state ministry had sent to all the rulers, Indian rulers. So it was a normal Instrument of Accession.
Was there any...
And after discussion, he did agree and he signed it. And VP Menon took it back. And that night on 26th evening, it's common knowledge that the meeting of the Defence Committee took place. And there they decided to accept the Instrument of Accession. And on 27th morning, the troops were flown.
Was there any substantial body of opinion within Srinagar which was supporting the Lashkar?
I don't think so. Maybe very small, but not very vocal at all. Because the popular mood was against. And those elements who perhaps were sympathetic to that Lashkar invasion did not surface themselves. Because the popular mood was with Sheikh Abdullah. And, the Muslim conference elements, which is, at that time they were called the Bakras, against the Shers, that is, the lion versus the goat or something. And that was the mood. They didn't want to come into the open, surface themselves, and get beaten up, so to say.
And your family, you say your father was a courtier, and you are, I imagine, Hindus.
Yeah.
And are you Pandits or of Punjabi origin?
No, Punjabi origin.
And how did your father feel about what was happening?
Well, as I told you, the apprehension was there. He didn't know what to do. You see, myself, my mother, and my sister, this was the total family we were in Srinagar. So now he of course was concerned about my mother and my sister. And on 7th of November or so, you see, as I told you, when I became a war correspondent, I got in touch with, of course, almost every day with either the Air Force pilots or with the army officers, etc., etc. And I learned from them that the planes that were going back were taking people out, those who wished to go. But you had to reach the airport to get into a plane. Now, how do you reach there? We had a car, but there was no petrol. So, couldn't move. So, ultimately on 7th of November, my father decided that since the whole thing was uncertain, it was safer to send out the women folk. So, my sister and my mother were, and my father and myself, with our Muslim servant, we took a tanga, a horse-driven carriage, to the airport. And the flight that was going, my sister and my mother were put in that and given the address in Delhi of some relation, etc., that once you get there, try yours and get hold of some transport and reach that point. That was all. But we stayed back. My father, myself, and our Muslim servant, we spent the whole winter there. Of course, I couldn't go away because now I'd taken on the responsibility as a war correspondent.
And as a war
But my father stayed back with me, and this Muslim servant used to sleep there. And we had a couple of guns and one rifle as part of the personal firearms. And a Muslim servant and myself, we used to spend the whole night in the attic. For 3 months, we used to sleep there with the guns ready, that in case something happens, we can defend ourselves. But nothing happened.
As a war correspondent, what did you see? What front were you on?
Well, at that particular time, there was only one front, and that was the Jhelum Valley Road. And the front was Patan, Baramulla, Uri. Beyond Uri, there was no place to go to.
Did you get to the scene of the fighting as a war correspondent?
Yes, of course.
And that was along that road?
Along the road. But from April onwards, of course, we went to Handwara and Lolab, and then ultimately Titwal, which was in May. Then, but first major action reporting that as war correspondent we did was the Gurez action in June. We were part of it it was a real war reporting that we did. We were part of the setup that pushed up, got engaged, and we saw the battle from very close quarters, say 100 yards, you might say, and reported back.
How did you report back from the front line?
As I told you, we used to do our dispatch, hand it over to the PRO, or if the PRO was nowhere around, then the signal officer. And those were the instructions. And they used to pass them on either through their Morse signal or through the landline to their headquarters, who would pass it on to Srinagar, and Srinagar would either through Morse signal or through the Air Force send it over to Delhi. Sometimes it took 3 days to get to our office.
Did it give you a taste for war reporting?
Pardon?
Did it give you a liking for war reporting?
Oh yes, I loved it, and I think that was... I've reported all the 4 wars of independent India as a war correspondent. Except Bangladesh, I've covered every action, every sector. And I have very vivid memories of every action. I've written about it, but not as a book.
How have you written about it? You've written something that's not been published, or...?
No, as I said, detailed reports I have done. And I have put down on paper all the important events or actions that I've been through. I haven't published all that because of various reasons. One of the reasons was that I thought that I may be putting things across. I didn't want to go through the Defense Ministry to get it vetted, because then half the matter that I want to publish would never be published. So I'm putting down on paper, may time come, or if I am no more, somebody else will do it, take it up. But I've put down on paper all that.
And how long did you remain in Srinagar as a journalist? What happened after the war?
No, I stayed on. Then I became correspondent of God knows how many things from BBC. I worked for BBC for 22 years as a stringer from that area. And I went to Afghanistan as this BBC stringer at one time. I worked for Reuters, I worked for New York Times, I worked for Voice of America, I worked for UPI of America, I worked for National Geographic, I worked for Illustrated London. What used to happen was that my terms with Times of India as their special correspondent was such that I told them, I said, look, there are not many correspondents in Kashmir. Kashmir is an important dateline. And off and on, people come from outside and they don't know what to do, and they make requests. And if you do not mind, if it does not interfere with my reporting for you, would you permit me to do odd pieces or stories, not regular basis as such, except for 2 permissions which they gave me, was Reuters and London Times. BBC. The London Times came much later. Now, these two permissions I had, and the permissions were given to me by Frank Moraes, because he was a great editor, I would say, and somehow he seemed to like me. He had confidence in me, and he liked my reporting, etc. So I got, you might say, special favor as such from him, allowing me to work for these two organizations.
Now, Frank Moraes was a very good friend of Margaret Bourke-White,
Yes,
who
of course.
came to Kashmir in late 47, early 48.
48.
And then Frank Moraes himself wrote a series of articles about Kashmir in the
That's right.
50s.
That's right.
And did you accompany him on that trip?
On a second trip that he came. First trip, I wasn't here. I'd gone out somewhere. Second trip, yes, I did. Then Frank Moraes in 1956 asked me to assist this well-known broadcaster, Melville de Mello, to do a whole feature on Baramulla. So I was involved in that too.
And who did Melville de Mello speak to? Who did he?
All, you see, we went and interviewed Father Shanks. We interviewed all the three sisters who were still there. We interviewed somebody from Maqbul Sherwani's family. We interviewed the political activists of that place. There was one gardener and somebody from the convent, etc. Lots of people.
And this was in the 50s?
56.
And this was for the BBC?
This was for, I think, BBC.
And is it radio or television?
No, radio. Radio. No cameraman was around.
And how long were you with the Times of India in Kashmir?
Till 1965.
So basically from 1947 on to
47
1965.
to with them. Then I resigned there. Then I joined UNI. And of course, I was working for London Times and I was working for BBC, etc. I stayed on with UNI till 78. Then I started, I gave up day-to-day reporting.
Mm-hmm.
I went over to I stayed on with Reuters and London Times and New York Times.
Doing analysis type pieces.
Analysis and working on commentaries for Voice of America. And then 82 I was asked by Sheikh Abdullah and later Farooq Abdullah to join the government. So they created a new post for me as Director General of Information. And I joined them in December 82 and stayed on till 89 in that post. With a break when Farooq Abdullah was dismissed, I resigned. When he came back, I was reappointed. But in 89, I resigned that post also and quit. Then I worked on my research work and books and things like that.
And when did you leave Srinagar?
I left Srinagar in 14th December 89.
14th of December 89. Because of the insurgency?
Yeah, I was under threat because I was Director General of Information and very close to Farooq Abdullah. And I was advised to leave Srinagar.
But you've been back?
Oh, yes. 94 onwards, I've been going there regularly.
Heading back to the late 40s, what happened? What went wrong between 47 and 53? Between Sheikh Abdullah taking power and him being jailed?
You see, to my mind, there were 2 or 3 reasons, factors. Firstly, Sheikh Abdullah was the most popular leader here. And Nehru and Abdullah struck very early friendship back in 39.
Why?
You know, Sheikh Abdullah at that time, after he uh, it was towards the end of the life of Muslim conference that Sheikh Abdullah perhaps realized, he hasn't talked to me on that, realized that he needed the backing of an all India organization. And he found that Congress perhaps was closer to the ideology that he had at that time. And then he went and attended their meetings of the All India States People's Conference. And there they found that he was a person who was a good orator, who could argue well, who could speak well, and who had the backing of his people, etc. So he was made the president of the All India States People Conference. And Jawaharlal was one of the leading lights of Indian National Congress. And Abdullah invited Nehru to come visit Srinagar. So he came in May 1940. He came to Jammu and then to Kashmir. And there he found that Sheikh Abdullah was the uncrowned head of the popular movement. So they got close to each other. And then, of course, family friendship and all came about. Then in 1946, when Sheikh Abdullah was jailed and was being tried for sedition, etc., Jawaharlal managed to arrange for his defense. He himself came, he brought Asaf Ali, he brought Bhulabhai Desai and 2 or 3 others, very, very well-known lawyers. So they became still much closer. Now, when 1947 transfer of power took place, Nehru was responsible for forcing this on the Maharaja, that we'll accept your accession and we'll also allow the defense of the forces to be sent by air. But in return, you will have to hand over the power to a popular government. Now, that was the period of turmoil, war, etc., etc. And Sheikh Abdullah was given a free hand, so to say, to decide what to do, deal with the situation, and deal with the political opponents also. Now, he, regardless of the rights of the political dissidents or others, he roughshod over the whole thing, which was not liked in Delhi and was, of course, resented by the anti-Abdullah elements in Kashmir. That was the beginning of it. Then, you see, situation being what it was, as I said, Sheikh Abdullah was given a free hand to deal with the situation in Kashmir. Delhi, at some point of time, thought that perhaps he was getting out of the normal limits of a leader of a state government. That was one aspect. Secondly, you see, he was sent as a member of the Indian delegation to United Nations. So in there and in Paris, out of, I think, carelessness, you might say, he talked to the press and he said a few things which perhaps were against the policy of Indian government at that time. I mean, it's difficult to pinpoint, but that was the beginning of the thing. And then, of course, the difficulties arose about the situation in Kashmir not being according to what Delhi wanted. In the meantime, lots of foreign elements wanted to visit Kashmir, and they started coming in, the Americans and the British and all, diplomats and all. And, of course, as head of the government, he had either to meet them or when they would call on him, or he had to entertain them and all. So some kind of, I won't call friendship, but association started. Now, I personally feel that perhaps the government of India felt that the Americans and the British were trying to get into the head of Sheikh Abdullah that this was the point of time when he could get more powers out of Delhi. So, the misunderstanding started from there. And out of carelessness, in certain press interviews he said few things which were not liked by Delhi. Now, perhaps Nehru may not have bothered too much about it, but then there were other elements in the government who didn't like Sheikh Abdullah's being given too much of authority and power at that time. So they must have or should have, on their own, tried to put spokes in the wheels. In the meantime, in Kashmir itself, two kinds of situations were running parallel. One was the dissidents within the National Conference started growing, with Bakshi Ghulam Ahmad and Shamlal Saraf and others on one side, and Sheikh Abdullah and Mirza Afzal Beg, etc. on the other side. This was the beginning of the disunity. Now this, on one hand, so in Delhi, again there were two elements, pro-Nehru and anti-Nehru. Pro-Nehru got along with Sheikh Abdullah, etc., and anti-Nehru used to get along with the other group here. So this was the beginning of misunderstanding, it seems, and the pressure was built up here. And so a delegation went to Delhi, and the meetings that used to take place here in the National Conference Working Committee and all, the reports used to trickle on to Delhi. And Delhi felt that a stage has come when Sheikh Abdullah needs to be reined. So the moment this decision was taken in Delhi, informally, Sheikh Abdullah didn't like it, of course. And here, the people who were with Sheikh Abdullah didn't like it. So they started pressurizing Sheikh Abdullah that this is a time when you can strike. So the beginning of 1953 forced Sheikh Abdullah to deliver a speech here in Ranbir Singhpura on 13th of April, in which he said that our relationship with India is still to be decided upon. Now this raised a lot of doubt in the minds of Delhi. So they sent Maulana Azad and then A.P. Jain and others to talk to Sheikh Abdullah and get this clarified, etc. But he stuck on to his what he had said.
Do you think Sheikh Abdullah wanted independence?
Well, you see, he had hinted at it in at number of places, in his speeches, in his press interviews, that this could be an alternative. So Delhi was a little upset about the whole thing. And the situation in summer of 1953 was such that Sheikh Abdullah might stand up and say that, to hell with you, get out, that kind of thing. Now, Delhi perhaps was sensing the danger. And since there was already dissension within the National Conference, and they made use of it. And then, as you know, the whole thing surfaced on 8th of August. And there was an opportunity for Karan Singh to act. He was, of course, told to act, and he acted.
I've never met Sheikh Abdullah. Describe him to me.
Oh, he was a very tall leader of men, very charming personality, tall, handsome, wonderful voice. He could sway the sentiments of people. He could recite Quran, which made an emotional appeal to anyone who listened to it. Then, you know, his arguments, he had a way of reaching your heart. And he, of course, had sacrificed his personal life for the sake of the people, so to say, because he devoted all his time, and he didn't build up any assets during that period. I'm talking, say, between 1931 and 1947 or so. And he went to jail a number of times, and he was a very popular leader in Kashmir and in parts of Jammu. He was, according to me, he was not a good politician. He was not a good statesman, but he was a very popular leader, a great orator. And he had a charisma about him. And I've seen women and old men sort of wanting to touch him. And they would be thrilled and excited, and they felt that they used to bring children with affliction to him, wanting Sheikh Abdullah only to touch them. And they felt that by his mere touch, the affliction will vanish, or things like that. I mean, he had that kind of following.
And now his grave is protected by Indian troops.
This is, I think, the biggest tragedy of Kashmir. Because I would rate Sheikh Abdullah as perhaps the greatest benefactor of Kashmiri people after the 16th century King Zainul Abidin, or the great Badshah, as he's called. I think he was the greatest Kashmiri. And what Kashmir was in 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, or even later, was to a very large extent his contribution.
Was he a socialist? Because the New Kashmir program was a socialist program, and then he renamed the central square Lal Chowk?
You see, he was a socialist for two reasons. Firstly, between 1936 and 39, he felt that it was not possible to achieve what he wanted for the people of Kashmir if he did not carry the non-Muslims with him. So he enlarged the scope of his political party and converted it from Muslim Conference into. And he was very popular with even non-Muslims, no doubt. But then, as I said, his association with the Congress and the All India States People Conference was such that, and that was the period when the Second World War had started. And the influence of the Soviet Union and the communists, etc., was on the rise. So to Kashmir also came the communists from the rest of the country. And among them was Dr. Ashraf and B.P.L. Bedi and a few others. Now, either they were sent by the Communist Party of India, I don't know. But they did come here, and they gradually got into the inner circle of the National Conference. That is Sheikh Abdullah and Bakshi Ghulam Ahmad and Ghulam Ahmad Sadiq and Ghulam Mahidin Kara and Mirza Afzal Beg and all those, and D.P. Dhar. And at one point of time, B.P.L. Bedi and Dr. Ashraf, they were the leading lights of the Communist Party at that time. They were involved in helping to draft the National Conference manifesto, which later on became the New Kashmir program. So it was largely on account of the influence of that and the overwhelming, atmosphere of the Soviet influence in India at that time on the Congress, because of the war on one hand and because of anti-British feelings on the other hand. So B.P.L. Bedi had quite a major hand. He and his wife, Freda Bedi, had quite a hand in...
Who was English?
She was English. She later on became a Buddhist monk with Dalai Lama. I met her in 1974 in Dharamsala. Freda was a good friend of mine, so was BPL Bedi. I knew him. He used to live in Lahore before he came to Kashmir. So they made a lot of contribution to the new Kashmir program, and it got that orientation of socialism. It was not against the liking of Sheikh Abdullah, but he accepted that and got it incorporated.
And then you served Sheikh Abdullah's son, Farooq Abdullah.
Yes, I had very good relations with Sheikh Abdullah. Very good friends. And I was fortunate. He gave me a lot of confidence. He used to talk to me at length.
So it's strange, your son, your father was a courtier
Yes.
of the Maharaja, and
Yes.
you worked with Sheikh Abdullah, his opponent.
Yeah. But that didn't mean a thing. I mean, personal equations are entirely different.
Just as a final question and observation, looking back on 47, 48, now Kashmir is still a mess. How do you feel about it?
You see, as in retrospect, everyone starts analyzing things, what went wrong. I think lots of things went wrong. And I hold New Delhi more responsible than anyone else in blunders that were committed, wrong decisions that were taken, rubbing people on the wrong side was done, not foresight and far-sightedness was shown. And I do not absolve the Indian press. I mean, I consider even myself responsible for it to some extent. I will put it that way because I was part of the Indian media which reported from Kashmir.
What do you mean by that?
No, I'll tell you. You see, if Indian media had been little more involved in Kashmir, they did not, and mind you, Kashmir over the last 55, 57 years has been one major element which has influenced and impacted every policy of Government of India, whether it's economic policy, defense policy, military policy, your developmental activities, your relationship with your neighbors, relationship with America, with everything. And that amount of attention was not paid to Kashmir. And I'm talking of the government as also the Indian press. If Indian press had taken more interest in Kashmir and reported more extensively, you see, till about 1980 or so, the press corps reporting for the national press was not more than 3 or 4 individuals. And that also was limited to the so-called national papers, like Hindustan Times, Statesman. And what space would they give? Not more than a few centimeters. So not adequate attention was paid either by New Delhi establishment or by the Indian press to the affairs of Jammu and Kashmir, its problems, its needs, its what was going on here. You see, we used to, I don't know, I retained my carbon copies for all my dispatches to everyone in Kashmir. But that, of course, after I came away, that was set fire to. So I lost all that. But such extensive reports we used to send. And all that we got was sometimes 10% of it appeared or sometimes 5% of it appeared. Lack of space. So, if adequate attention and adequate